Welcome back, Didier.
My pleasure, Aditya.
Besides recording studios that we spoke of in the last part, what else do you kind of work on designing spaces? What kind of projects do you undertake?
So our scope usually is acoustics for music, and
Okay.
that's the short explanation of what we do. So music is not only in studios. Hopefully, it's somewhere else. So we have a scope of different possibilities like auditoriums, concert halls, smaller clubs where they play live music, or even clubs with no live music. I mean, this is where music is, and we have to bring an acoustical quality into the project. So that's so we have sometimes extended to bars, but still we would like just to be there for the proper reason, not to put a few ceiling speakers and be done with that. It's just first we take care of the acoustical environment always, and then we put the electroacoustic system. So that means it has to be also in collaboration with the interior designer, the architect, and there must be some flexibility from them and from us, obviously. But that means we have to agree together. If they say, well, there is nothing you can do, but make it sound proper, that's not our projects. Okay. So that's one side. The other side would be that we have a big base of high quality home theaters in the big cities usually, for usually people interested about quality, who have enough wealth to invest into something a bit meaningful. It's not a theater in a box type, it's a real mini cinema. Actually, we take that as like a mini mix stage.
Okay.
That means if the sound engineer, when he does the final mix of the movie, sits and makes decision according to his position and his environment, we want to have the same experience to be brought to the listener when they listen to the movie. That means they are actually in the position of the sound engineer, and they hear exactly what was intended to be produced, to be heard. So the whole concept is about using typically the Dolby requirements, Dolby Premiere sometimes. We use Atmos recently as a format that's been requested many times. We don't push for Atmos. We just say if you have an extended budget, we can go into that. That's not that we like doing that also, but sometimes it's just 5.1, 7.1. There are several formats that are possible there. So high-end home theaters, I would say, not specifically in terms of cost, but in terms of we try the best in terms of quality. It has to be a dedicated room. Right. We don't do let's say a living room that we would just put some speakers in the corner because the acoustical environment has to be properly treated. And also isolated, because there might be the baby sleeping just the next room. Yes. So we need to have a real good isolation there for sure. Right. So home theater is also one of the big branch of sound whistle. And we have home studios that are not typically the professional one we spoke on the previous interview, but about much more a proper tool for musicians to do some production at a reasonable cost, because that's a different approach. Obviously, the cost factor has a big impact on the decision process there.
True. So speaking of home studios, home recording studios, Didier, we have thanks to lower budgets and music being, even for film, as one of the last thing that comes to the producer's mind, and whenever it comes to that, they never have the money to pay.
I heard about that, yes.
So, and they still want grand sounding scores and stuff. Yeah. So many are working from home now because and in a place like Bombay, they can't afford a commercial space. And so one bedroom becomes a studio in the house and things like that. And not many can afford to have a complete proper studio done, and so they end up buying these ready to install panels that are available in the market now and make do with that.
Yes.
So what is your take on that kind of a setup where people just buy these acoustic kits and get started? So what are things to be done, not to be done in such cases?
Well, I'm not here to push any specific budget, because everybody has a different scale, and according to the income they can get from their art, they can or not invest. I'm not there to judge what they should do.
Okay.
But what I can say is that obviously there is an impact on the final quality of the recording if the treatment is not good enough or it's not appropriate, because there's also the thing of sometimes buying stuff which is actually not appropriate to your specific requirements. So it's, I think, more about intelligent investment instead of buying anything, saying, oh, it says acoustics, so it must be. I had people very often confusing totally isolation and acoustical treatment. That means saying, I purchase a set of panels I put on the wall, like typically some high density glass wool and all that, and still it's leaking to the next building, thinking that whatever they have put in the room would be preventing the leakage or improving the leakage. To improve the leakage, when you do that, you need to put a lot of stuff, and it's going to be reducing maybe a few dB of the reverberation time, but very, very little. So it has nothing to do with isolation. Isolation is a different topic. So usually, typically in a home studio, there is the isolation part is almost impossible to implement, because that's the costly part of the acoustics, the most costly, the most complicated one, because it has to be total. You cannot just do partial isolation. So it's usually floating shells, I mean, room in a room, stuff like that. Otherwise, you don't get anywhere. So basically, the only thing you can think about is to have a double window, a double door, and then after that, there's nothing much you can do, really. Nothing will be meaningful in terms of investment. It's not going to help. So if your environment is a bit quiet, you're lucky. And if you don't have any sensitive neighbor, you're lucky also, because it goes both ways, actually. So that's a bit tricky. So that's the first thing to be sure about, you see. Because if this is under control, the rest is the easy part. And the isolation is always the most complicated one.
Right.
So after what do you do? Is it a control room? Is it a recording space? Or is it both in the same room? So, which happens.
Yes.
So that you have to see, because then it's 3 different approaches. If it's a recording space, only because your rig is in a different room and then you connected through a cable, a camera, or something like that, which happens sometimes. So what is the imprint of the room? I would advise, if possible, to go to something fairly dry, because a small room, if it's not properly diffused, not properly treated, will sound very quickly like a bathroom, and it's not nice. And when you start laying tracks, you will have information from an instrument and the, let's say, bathroom effect, and then the second and the bathroom effect, and then at the end all this bathroom effect will be cumulating, because they will be the same in phase and adding up, while the instrument will not adding up, because they will be having different frequency range and all that. So that means you, at the end, you proportionally add up the room to each other, to each of the take, and then you end up with something that's unmanageable. So think about dry is best. And I'm not saying that's the best to do in music production from far, but that's at least a mistake not to do when you have a home situation.
Right.
So then if we have a control room situation as a home situation, it's about symmetry, because you don't want to be skewed when you do a stereo panning and all that. So if you have a very different left information from the right because of the reflection patterns into the room, you have a full stereo. Your center channel, your so-called phantom center, is not going to be very strong. So it's very difficult to do any balancing, any mixing based on that. So the symmetry of the room is one thing. The early reflections, the first reflections to the listening position are to be removed, because they are going to do some what we call comb filtering, so coloring the sound. So this coloration has to be minimum. So that in this case, these kits are pretty useful, because they would be placed at the proper area. They would be removing this first reflection, maybe the second reflections, but at least the first one, to the listening position. And then after that, you will have to have a diffuse field maybe on the back. Very great care of the low frequencies, because that's the difficult part in the design. So then you have 2 options. One is to absorb it, and absorbing low frequency is damn difficult if you don't have much space and much budget. So I would advise to go for diaphragmatic bass traps. You know, these bass traps that are panels that are vibrating. That's the most efficient cost, and they don't take space because they have to be against boundaries and they are pretty thin. So bass trap behind the listening position. There are different placements that can be tried and that give a much better result in terms of low frequency response. The other options, if you can afford, not financially because it's cheap, but in terms of location, is to let the low frequency leak to outside. That means you would be having typically a partition that goes to another room,
Yes.
and the other room will be, the partition will be thin enough to let the low frequency go through and get kind of absorbed by inside the other room because it's not going to come back easily. And then you let this energy go out of the room without coming back. So that's very, very useful tip to do low frequency absorption. But then you need to have another room or some outside space,
Or if it's a balcony, yeah.
balcony, something like that. It's possible. So that's efficient in terms of cost. Because then the this leakage and if you do let's say typically a partition in gypsum, really not too thick, really relatively thin, that will block fairly good mid and high frequencies from outside. That means you won't be too much bothered by that, but it will let the low frequency leak to outside. That means removing the energy from the room.
Right.
So that's the control room, and if you have a combination between control room and recording space in the same room, then you kind of superpose the two concepts together. You do first your control room, and then you decide to add some diffusion, add some reverberation treatment, and diffusion treatment if you can, to get a more rich texture into the sound. Maybe on the back of the room, so use a bit the back of the room for the recording, a bit more the front for the mixing, for the monitoring, and then you have a bit both of two worlds. It's a more complicated situation, but it's very much possible.
Right. A lot of rooms, obviously, since they are bedrooms, will have a window.
Yes.
And glass.
Yes.
And they say ideally glass should not be there as a reflection surface. Because
glass can be a problem, but glass has also the very good property of letting the low frequency go through. If the glass is thin enough, that means we get a bass trap, also because of diaphragmatic effect.
So should the glass be covered?
So now the glass, like everything, can be good and bad depending on where it's located.
Okay.
Having a surface that is a hard surface, like a glass, is not a problem by itself if it's located properly inside the room. So that means if the glass is a fixed parameter because it's there, you make your room orientation according to the glazings, not to have the first reflections going into the glass, and you look at a bit the reflection patterns to maybe have the glazing work for you instead of against you. And it's not, I've done in some studio, that typically Harris, Jayaraj, Studio H, there is quite a lot of glazing and hard surfaces in the studio, in the control room itself, not only the recording space, but the control room, and it works very well because they have been placed. Here we had a simulation tool to decide where to place them, but after the second or third reflection, that means they will sustain the energy in the room, but not make a direct mess into the signal that you're listening to.
Right. So ideally the speakers should be facing towards the glass, away from the glass. Any tip on that?
Well, I would prefer towards the glass is always the problem of the reflection coming back to the listening position, so you have to be careful about that. So it will be away from, for sure. Again, there's no rule because it depends on the room, and it has to be. My number one rule is the symmetry, at least symmetry of the front part of the signal. If on your back you have not so great symmetry, it's still okay because what comes back is a bit less important, but the front part has to be really symmetrical. Right. So if you have a glazing, let's say on the left, because you have a window there, I would suggest that you put a mirror on the right. A glass that's a mirror, just it's going to be making your room look bigger and simulating the fact that there is another glazing on the other side, though it's not a window, but it has about the same properties. Okay. So the symmetrical, you have a glass, you put a mirror. So that's a easy tip to create a symmetry.
Right. A lot of sound goes to the flat below you.
Yes.
And then they'll call in the night and say, please stop the music. And
Yeah.
a lot of thumping that goes,
Yes.
to the flat below you, the room below you. So how does one reduce that?
As I told you just before, the isolation is the number one complication. It's not acoustical treatment because that can be moved, the panels can be changed, improved, you can do phase by phase, and that's the fun part. The not so fun part is the isolation because it, as I said before, it has to be total. I'm not saying that it has to be absolute, but it has to be coherent. That means you can have easily 20, 30 dB isolation with one technique, and then a 40, 50, or even up to 80 dB isolation if you really do floating into floating. So you have different scale of isolation, but when you take one scale, when you decide about one parameter of isolation, you need to be coherent, and it has to be done everywhere. You cannot just say, well, I'm going to do the ceiling, hoping the sound is not going to go upstairs, because technically the sound is going to hit the walls and go structurally to the upper floors and the down floors, and basically the sound is going to reach the top thing. So unless you do everything in the same way, not maybe the same materials but the same isolation values, you don't do anything meaningful. Covering a ceiling, it's a shielding, but its shielding is really, let's say, give a 5 to 10 dB isolation. After that, it's not working. After that, you need to go to the next level. And 5 to 10 dB, it's when you play, when you have a rock drummer at 110 dB in the room, it's not helpful. It's not going to be enough. So we did some recording studio in Mumbai, starting with 8 feet, and we did a double room within a double the floating shell.
A room within a room.
A room within a room. A room within a room within a room. Because they were producing rock music, and there was a bedroom on top, and it worked. So it's possible. It's just that it's damn complicated and costly.
Did the guy have space to stand?
Yeah, the thing at the end it's a bit, but still we managed to keep enough to not to feel that. Also, there's a few tricks by adding mirrors to make it bigger, light daylight to go to outside to not feel oppressed by the size, the small size, light colors, lighting, proper lighting. Yes, there are ways to make it look a bit bigger. So we have also the scope. I didn't mention that part of our design is also the interior design, the look, and the specific taste of the client enters that into the consideration, and we do a proper study rendering, 3D rendering to see, okay, well, you like this texture, this color, this material, or this one or that one, and then we work together about that. You see.
Right. So, Didier, in small town India, people who are watching this video from various parts, they'll obviously say that, please help us if this is the right solution, because material is also not available everywhere. So many have written to us in the past. I'm just talking about some experiences from earlier.
Yeah.
They say, if we put a thick carpet,
yes,
and heavy drapes, and jolly board, there used to be this jolly boards. Is that enough to get started with?
Well, sometimes it's better than nothing, but sometimes it's worse.
Okay.
Yeah, because the thing is that what happens with that kind of treatment, typically the carpets, even the drapes, the so-called jolly boards, they will have a frequency range of efficiency that's very small. It's going to be mid and high frequencies, starting from, let's say, typically 500 Hertz upwards, and maybe a bit below if you're lucky, if you have a heavy drape, but it's not broadband. So what's going to happen is that at the beginning you start with a reverberation time that's relatively high, a bit unmanageable, but kind of okay balanced. I mean, you have something that is usually within the ballpark, a straight line, sloping but straight line. And then you put this treatment and you feel it's better because, it sounds more muffled, more under control, and reverberation time would be much lower, which is true in the mid and high frequencies. But if you do a measurement, the low frequency have not been touched. So that means instead of having a coherent reverberation time, you start having one that is I mean, typically the term you use in India, you say it's boomy.
Yes.
You see, so it's you play a tabla, you play anything like that, and it's like, and it's way too much compared to the rest of the signal. So you create an unbalance, you create a lack of balance within the signal, because you actually attended to only part of the frequency range, the frequency that's easy to deal with, because there's a rule that says that the thickness of the material is directly proportional to the frequency range. It's physics, pure physics. And so if you have typically you work on 2 to 4 inch of treatment, you will be easily reaching down to 400 hertz, maybe. That's all. But after that, if you don't have any different thicknesses or different techniques, also sometimes, like diaphragmatic is one of them, you are going to have a very unbalanced result. So I'm saying sometimes it's better than nothing, but be careful, and maybe don't overdo it also, because putting carpet and stuff everywhere, that's not required. Also, there is this common mistake, thinking that by taming the high frequencies is helping. My take is not true. I mean, I don't find very helpful. Usually, if there's a mistake done, or especially, I think it's a very strong tendency in India that there is a overabsorption in the mid and high mid and high frequencies. Let's say everything from 2 kilohertz upwards is usually way too much absorbed, because already the body, the clothing is absorbing, anything is absorbing that kind of frequency, and there is a lack of liveness into the result, into the recordings, but into when I say liveness, it's natural. More than liveness itself, it's a lack of transparency, of natural. So even the monitoring is impaired, because the balance that you get at the listening position is not a natural one. It's all taking into account an acoustical treatment that's not linear. And I would much more value a linear treatment at a lower efficiency instead of a higher efficiency, which is totally skewed. That's my advice, if I can.
Thank you for that. And for every individual, our ears are our best microphones.
Yes.
So when you walk into somebody's room, which is not done by you, how do you kind of judge whether it's being done well or not without any tools? And using your ears, how does one know that this room is a good sounding room, so I can engage the studio for my project?
Okay. Usually my main concern is about the control room. Because the recording space, there's always ways to go around a not so well designed room by using proper microphone placement, close miking, using this shield made of foams, and there's a lot of available tools to solve if there is a problem. That's not too complicated to solve. For the control room, it's much more complicated, because you cannot redesign the thing. So my advice would be to have your own music material that you know super well. That means you have a few tracks, maximum 10, but 3 is good enough. That's very well produced, very well recorded, with some vocal elements inside, because that's much more obvious in terms of texture and tone. And that you've been listening your whole life in different places in very good headphones as a reference. And I mean, that's you've been, and then you play that in every in the new control room that you're visiting, and then you listen. And then if you don't recognize what you've been doing, here we have a problem. You see, you can decide maybe I'm not going to work there, or maybe we can do a bit of tuning. Then either you don't know how to do that, you ask somebody to help to get your picture, your sonic picture correct, or you know a bit more, and then you do it. So you start doing your room calibration, which I've been presenting yesterday at Palm, which is a step-by-step process to get some parameters, not all, because some parameters you will not be able to correct. It's a purely acoustical impairment that cannot be corrected with DSP or whatever processor. But some you will be able to correct. And maybe that's good enough. But your reference, without measuring anything, will be the music or the soundtrack that you know very well, or that you produce yourself and you are happy about it, and then you know how it should sound. And if it doesn't sound that way in this control room, then we have a problem there.
Okay. So that's a good test and simple
Yeah,
one.
it's a simple one. I would advise everybody to do ear training. There's a beautiful book from Alton Everest. Alton Everest, he's an acoustician. He wrote a book with there are 2 CDs inside that can be used to train your ears to recognize which frequency. So it gives several frequencies, and you have to name them. Then after it creates a situation where you have distortion levels, THD, that's increasing, and then you have to recognize when it comes. Then you have the phase recognition. You have so many aspects that you need to learn. I believe that everybody is capable of learning that. It's not only for acoustician. It's everybody has plus minus the same tool here. It's just the recognition of the content that is not there because of lack of understanding or training. But this is not a complicated thing to do. So I would recommend that everybody does the training through that kind of this material or some other material on the net. There are many options, but at the end, playing music, listening to the content in different places, learning how it should sound, and learning, okay, it sounds a bit muffled, it sounds a bit, you have different terms that you can use, and then it's immediately, if you close your eyes, you listen, you see typically the equalization you can bring to make it better. And again, don't overkill on equalization also. I would also advise to be careful about that. And less is best usually. But yeah, that's the advice I would give.
Right. So Didier, we have this home studio setups having primarily near field monitors because of so many restrictions. Yes. So what is an ideal angle to keep the speakers, or what is a listening spot that they say that, it sounds best here?
Yeah.
Not at the sofa behind.
Yes.
So what is that? Is there any...
But the first thing to understand is that on the near field situation, the loudspeakers, they have only 2 options of placement. First, if the room is symmetrical, that's one thing. But then according to the wall that's going to be on the back, either you put the loudspeakers very close to the wall, or relatively far. You cannot put in between. So why? Because if you put the speaker, let's say at 2 feet from the wall, you would be having a lot of energy at the low frequencies that is omnidirectional, that goes to the back and comes back with a delay because of the time travel, and the same signal mixing with the signal from the loudspeaker at a delay will create comb filtering. So you have dips in the frequency response of the speaker created by these reflections on the back. So you can put very costly bass traps behind the loudspeakers, but maybe that's not the best use of your money to do that. So either you put your loudspeakers far from the boundary, so that the reverberant energy, I mean the reflected energy back, is first at a lower frequency because of the wavelength of the whole thing, or it's at the lower level because of the loss you get from the distance. There is a dB loss. So so far, I would say at least 3-4 feet, at least, which is a lot if it's a small room. So usually it's not possible. So I would then say, to avoid this low frequency problem, you will put them closer to the boundary, which then might be a problem into isolation to the next room, but at least you don't get any dips and so after the positioning has to be careful not to excite what we call the modal response of the room. That means the resonance of the room itself. So trial and error to check what's the best, and the width of the positioning is also depending on your approach to the music. So I would really ask you to play your preferred soundtrack and to listen to you will be, somebody maybe will be helping you, moving you close your eyes, you don't want to know what's happening, and then you're moving like that on the left to right, symmetrical, and then there will be the effect of when you go too far, you might be losing the central channel, the phantom center, which is basically coming from the fact that it's properly balanced between left and right. It might be a full stereo, and then you go too far, you might be losing the width of the thing. So it's your own approach. There is a ITU requirement, which is plus minus 30 degree, which is a 60-degree angle, which is a good start. But I'm not saying that's the only option. You can plus minus. Some they prefer to have it closer because also they create wider productions because they have to work harder to get a wide thing because it's close monitoring. So they create a situation that's difficult for them, but what they release outside is going to sound wider in terms of stereo because they had to fight against the monitoring. Some they have a too wide monitoring, and when they listen outside, they feel it's almost mono. So it's a tool. It's not a hi-fi where you put your thing to make yourself happy. It has to be meaningful in terms of what do you want, what's the purpose, and to feel comfortable with that. So
Right.
more or less that's the guidelines.
That's a very important tip. Thank you so much for that. And should the monitors be kept on the desk, on a foam on the desk, on stands? How does that also kind of affect?
I would advise, if possible, to have them on stands to decouple from the furniture itself. Because even though you put them on foam, there's still a proximity effect that couples the loudspeaker at low frequencies to the desk, and the desk becomes a musical instrument. It becomes generating some sound, mixing with the loudspeakers, and you get some blurring in the low frequency range because of that, or unless you have a super good decoupling, but even that, the proximity is going to be a problem. So if you can put them a bit behind the desk and not touching the desk physically, I would not also recommend having them on the on mounts on the wall, because then the wall becomes the musical instrument. There is still, though you have a foam, it's still transmitting some of the energy. So to have an independent thing, maybe with already a decoupling at the base and the decoupling at the speaker, then you're safe. And clearly most of the floors are made of heavy concrete. To create a musical instrument from heavy concrete, you need to listen super loud. It's different from having a gypsum partition, which will be immediately acting as a loudspeaker.
Any other tips that you'd like to share with the viewers in terms of how can they enhance their own small setups at home?
Yeah. The tips I would give are just based on more general terms. So it's quite depending upon the exact purpose, exact taste. It's really taste based. I would really be very careful with the first tip I would give is a bit very careful about usually the huge amount of equipment that is interfering with the path of the sound from the loudspeakers. And when I do typically an acoustical measurement of a main monitoring or even a near field in a room that's been built by us, I get amazing results because it's super flat, it's low distortion, and there is no problem in the thing. Then the integrator comes, puts everywhere screens, mixing boards, racks, and all that, and I make a measurement, the same measurement, and I'm crying. So don't shoot in your own foot by doing that, because you can buy super expensive speaker, do some treatment that's going to be a bit expensive also, and mess up the whole thing by having an environment that is creating too much reflections and distortions. So low profile is the tip, is getting the path from the loudspeakers to you as clear as possible. If you need to have a screen, which is obviously the case, put it sloped, basically low profile as much as possible around you like that, and not blocking anything. And even that, you need to be sure that there is no reflections from the screen to you, so the placement and the angle should be correct. So you take a piece of mirror and you put it on the LCD screen, and then you look at the screen, at your screen, and if you see your loudspeaker, it's not at the proper position, because that's basically the path. So you just move your screen until you don't see your loudspeakers anymore. That means they are not going to reflect the energy to the listening position. So that's you buy a piece of mirror just for that. It's cheap, and that's the best thing you can do to save yourself.
Right. Didier, thank you so much for sharing these small but invaluable tips to so many viewers of our channel, and thank you for spending time with us.
Aditya, it's a real pleasure. I can see you're also passionate about the topic, and I think we all are if we're watching here
Right.
your channel. So that's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much.